Before I proceed further, please note this session is being recorded purely for the academic purpose with no commercial agenda. The organizing committee has obtained the permission of the resource persons for the same. Now, we started our conference 2 days back with Asmita ma'am's session on how to consume conference content. And so far, we listened to speakers all around the globe and understood assessment and diagnostic practices that are followed in different countries. Now, it's time for us to consolidate our learning. And our next guest speaker, Ms. Radhika Chandrasekhar, will help us to do the same. So thank you IIOC team for giving me the pleasure to introduce Radhika ma'am, our next guest speaker of the session. So Radhika ma'am, So Radhika ma'am is a clinical psychologist and a certified art-based therapist. She started her career as a school psychologist and coordinated psychometric assessment and counseling services for children and adolescents across more than 20 schools in Mumbai. Radhika ma'am then functioned as lower and middle school coordinator at the Gateway School of Mumbai, where she was instrumental in developing a comprehensive system for risk assessment, documentation, and monitoring of each student's IP that incorporated. She also played a vital role in setting school-wide structures and team training for virtual schooling and therapy during COVID-19 pandemic. Currently, she works as a freelance educational consultant and teacher trainer with rich experience in working with some national and international leaders in education, such as Tata Institute of Social Sciences and UNESCO. She is passionate about creating inclusive environment, disseminating social emotional learning, and leveraging technology to enable inclusion. It is our pleasure to have you here, Radhika ma'am. I request you to kindly take over the session. The stage is all yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Vinita. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the last half hour of this fantastic 3-day conference, I should say. And I hope I can do justice to bringing it to a close. So let's begin. So, Dr. Asmita began at the start of the session, we wanted to sort of help consume the content of the conference above and beyond simply disseminating the information in the conference. And that's kind of how this session came to be. One of the conversations that I was having with Dr. Asmita, where she talked about, there's so much information that comes to us in these conferences, often over days, over multiple sessions. In this conference in particular, across multiple countries, where learning about so much that it can always be too much. And receiving too much information can often be immobilizing, right? You don't know where to start, what to do next. You've sort of sat through for 3 days and taken in so much that it almost immobilizes us and tells us, okay, now what? So that's kind of how this session came to be. This session is meant to help start the process. But of course, the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how significant a task Dr. Hudar was asking me to do. She's asking me to help start the process, but she said, essentially she's asking me to summarize the information across 7 different countries, which has been disseminated over 10 and a half hours, capture all of those highlights, but also help over 200 people or 191 people, as I can see, turn these highlights into action. And my reaction to that was, what? It seemed like almost too great a challenge. But I like challenges and I was excited to take this on. I have been a clinical psychologist for a few years, and I have spent a good few years working in the field of identification and intervention. So definitely the topic of this conference is something that is very close to my heart. In addition to that, I happen to have recently moved from India to Canada, and one of the things that I'm engaging in now is to try and understand the systems here. And again, something that just aligns so beautifully with what this conference is trying to do. And I felt like, all right, challenge accepted. We're going to try and do this in the next 30 minutes. So what's the plan? The plan is this. I want to do a quick audience check before I start sharing what I'm going to be sharing. Then, just so we're on the same page, I want to share a little bit about my perspective and where I'm coming from as I am approaching this entire session. And then, of course, get to the meat of it, my process and my reflections throughout the session. However, the more I thought about it, I said to myself, you know what? We always say two heads are better than one. And I can certainly imagine that that will be true as you scale that up. So I imagine 200 heads are better than my one head as well. So we're going to do something that hopefully gets all the 193 heads in this session thinking and working with me as we go forward. And right at the very end, I do want to take a minute and talk about experimentation and risk, and we'll discuss that right at the end. So let's begin with a quick audience check. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use something called Mentimeter, and I'm going to share this link with you now. So I'm putting this link in the chat, and I want everyone to click on the link. You can do this if you're on your desktop, you can simply click on the link and open a tab. If you have logged in through your phone, again, you can just click on the link and you can go there for a minute. And we're going to do a quick audience check. It's been 2 days of this conference, and I want to kind of understand where everyone is, how everyone is feeling. And I love that the first response is that you're tired. Fantastic. And I can completely understand that feeling. But you notice you have the option to fill 3 phrases. So go a little bit beyond just the physical feeling of exhaustion and tiredness and think about what else has this done cognitively. Where are you in this, in your space, in your head at the end of this 3-day conference? I can see that about 11 people or 12 people have logged in and responded. You can see that little number at the bottom of my screen here. In case you haven't logged in, just click on the link in the chat. In case for whatever reason that is being difficult, you can also go to www.menti.com and type in this code and you will reach the same page. If you finish typing in, I want you to come back to this screen and look at the words that we're seeing on the screen. The more that a word has been used by the participants in your responses, the larger that word is going to appear on this word cloud. And it's of course a live word cloud that's being edited as more and more responses are coming in. And I'm happy to see that while the first word that we saw on the screen was tired, the words that are now showing up are words like informative, enlightened, knowledgeable, empowered, happy, well-informed, enthusiastic, enriched, charged. I'm glad to see that there's a lot of buzzing energy, a lot of potential has been developed. Hopefully potential that we're not going to let go. We're going to hold on to that excitement, and we're going to try and use this next 30 minutes to see how we can turn that into directed action and not just leave it at this, buzzing feeling that then dies down. We want to carry that buzzing feeling through to your classroom tomorrow morning. And see what we can do with it. This is wonderful. I'm seeing words like globalized, amazing. Of course, we have words like tired and overwhelmed. And that's exactly what I'm hoping that I will be able to help you sift through and get into the meat of what we're trying to do here. I love how it says traveled a lot. It really does feel like I've traveled through multiple countries over the last 10 hours and seen what it looks like across the world. Fantastic. We have 81 responses. This is going to continue to be live, and I recommend for everyone to engage in this exercise, even though we're now going to move on to the next bit, because it helps to first check in, where am I? If I am very exhausted, if I am very tired, I want to take a minute to first collect my thoughts before I put anything into action. If I am feeling really empowered, excited, and enlightened, I want to take these feelings and turn them into something concrete that I can actually make use of, and not just let them die down there. So take a second and check your own feelings for a minute. And now let's come back to our presentation. All right. So we did a little audience check, and I'm so excited to see where everyone is at. With that, let me share a little bit about my perspective going into this. So my thoughts were really all over the place. I was wondering, how do I summarize all of this? How do I capture these big ideas? We've had 90-minute sessions for every country, and it's just impossible for me to capture everything. I thought to myself, should I just maybe go through a checklist? Should I go through maybe our 15 probe questions that Dr. Asmita had shared at the beginning? And I can maybe just say, okay, you know what? Question number 1, here's what all the countries said. Question 2, here's what all the countries said. And I was very tempted to go down this road. But then I started to think, would I then just be repeating the same information that we've already gone through? Am I really adding anything more? Would it merely be a superficial comparison? Would I be also stuck then at the knowledge collection level rather than at the actionable level? So I said, all right, the onus of understanding the content actually falls on all of us. So instead, I said, let me acknowledge me in this situation. I cannot deny that I do have a perspective I bring to this. I happen to have resided in India for the last few years. I happen to have worked in India in this field for the last few years. And I cannot separate my experiences from the way that I'm approaching all of this content. And I thought to myself that I don't need to, because all of us have one country that we're sort of grounding our understanding in. I am Indian, and that's the context that my understanding is grounded in. And I'm hoping that the principles of this consumption of content that I'm going to share with you will apply to you regardless of which country you come from. Lastly, I do want to also share that I am currently sitting in Canada, and there's a huge time difference between the sessions themselves and the time that I've been at. So I have, out of 7 countries, managed to unfortunately only attend 4, and I'm going to try and see if I can maybe get the recordings for the remaining 3. So I might be a little limited in my scope right now, as I'm approaching this only from the perspective of 4 different countries. However, the principles that underlie that consumption still remain the same. So I'm hoping that there's still something you can take away from this session regardless. Okay, so let's get into it. Let me share with you my process and how I've reflected throughout the session. The first thing I said was I went back to what Dr. Asmita Huddar has shared in the first session. She said that we look at understanding, we look at actionables, and we look at policy changes, right? So when I said, okay, in terms of understanding, what am I seeking to understand? I knew right up front when I looked at those probe questions, there were definitely some that stood out to me. I was curious to know, hey, how is this defined across? Because I know that in the beginning we were told that definitions were challenging and that it was difficult for us to all be on the same page. So I was curious about, what are these definitions? How are we defining SLD across countries? I was curious about the onus. Who takes charge? Who is responsible for ensuring that assessments get done? Is it the parents? Is it the government? Is it the system? Is it the school? Is it the teachers? Is it the special educator? Who's really kind of taking charge of that system? And I was definitely curious to answer that question for various countries. And lastly, we have been in the midst of a pandemic for the last 1.5 years now or longer. And I was definitely curious to know how have other countries adapted to this? And so I knew I was going in with a set of questions. And then I wanted to kind of also look at what's similar and what's different across countries. Are there any insights that I can draw from this to help improve our own system? The next bit is the action itself. And here's where I think a reminder to all of us, and definitely a reminder to myself, was that we look at action in two different ways. Action can be your day to day action. What is going to change tomorrow when I walk into my class? Am I going to think a little bit differently? Is my perspective going to shift? Am I going to literally do something different today? Am I going to reach out to more people? Am I going to have more discussions? Am I going to define something differently? What is it going to look like on a day to day level? But also, what is it going to look like at the policy level, at that SOP level, at that standard operating procedures? What is going to change in the long run? And I also sometimes think that we tend to separate ourselves from the policy makers, not realizing that in fact it is the teachers and educators at the ground level with the kids who need to be driving these policy changes. And so I'm really excited for so many of us who are at the ground level to have received this kind of knowledge today, that we can hopefully turn into action, but don't limit the action just to our day to day, but to also think of larger policy level changes. Okay, the first big thing that stood out to me was this: the response to intervention, or the MDSS, the multi-tiered systems of support. I noticed that a lot of countries across the board were sort of using this as a lens. And in case you're not familiar with it, of course, our response to intervention model tells us that at tier one, we want to provide universal screening and support to our students. And that tends to support about 80 to 90% of our students in the classroom. There are going to be some students that will require targeted support, students who may be at risk. At this stage, we often engage in push-in support. We're not necessarily engaging in diagnoses. And lastly, you still have certain students who may require further individualized support because they may have intensive or persistent challenges that require a more intensive or persistent support system in order to help them navigate these challenges. I noticed that most countries are looking at their systems through this model. What I loved was how much emphasis there was on that tier one, which we often tend to forget. And I know, having been in special education, I see more of those tier three students on a day-to-day basis. And I forget the level of support, the level of effort that has to and does go in at that tier one level. I noticed that in Malaysia, you had screening happening for children at a very young age. And in Australia, you had co-teaching and push-in having become the norm. So special educators aren't necessarily doing pull-outs, but are pushing in co-teaching with the general educator. You have multidisciplinary teams in the US that are combining together to address these challenges, and a lot of universal practices, best practices being incorporated at that tier one level. It made me think about how that's something that we should be trying to do as well. As an educator who tends to generally see tier three, we need to also be going to tier one and looking at what can change there, such that there are fewer students who need that tier three support in the long run. The next thing I noticed was a focus on persistent difficulties. Of course, this is driven by the changes in the DSM criteria itself. So from DSM 4TR to DSM 5, the definition of learning, what used to be learning disability, is now changed. And SLT now requires that demonstrated persistent academic difficulties despite the provision of appropriate and evidence-based interventions. This is key. And I know this is something that when I was doing assessments and diagnoses, we struggled with. We struggled when we saw kids who were struggling for many, many years at grade 9, grade 10, and not really having received support. So while we had no choice but to give that diagnosis so that at the very least they would receive the support now at grade 10, we did have to kind of wonder what would have happened if they'd gotten that support before. Have they received that kind of intervention before? I noticed in Malaysia, we had 1 year remedial requirements. In the US, we had, they examined, in fact, what kind of education and support was provided. So to go back and look at what exactly was happening over maybe the last couple of years for this child, and have they received support, for us to say that no, truly there is a disability or a difficulty present here. I don't have answers. So of course, my first thought that I get was how do we check and ensure this in our country as well? The reality is I don't know yet, but these are some of the questions that I'm left pondering on as I move forward from this session. I know that in the session from India, we talked about language complications. Linguistically, India is a very diverse country, and I was certainly curious to know what are other countries doing to navigate this issue of language, because most of our assessments are in English. Most of our assessments are standardized on populations that speak English, but the populations we're working with are all multilingual. I noticed that in the US, you have Spanish alternatives because that tends to be the predominant second language available. In Malaysia, Malay is the primary language, and that was fascinating to me. The idea that all of their tests, all of their checklists, from the medical practitioner right to the teacher in the classroom, everything is in Malay. And I can just imagine the accessibility for the children in that school as a result of that. And I wondered then, perhaps is this the road for us in India as well, that we need to be developing tests then across multiple languages. It's a massive challenge. I don't know again what could be the solution. Which one of these systems could be mirrored in India, or do we have to find a third system, a middle ground? But it certainly added a lot of nuance and perspective to being able to think like this. The next thing I noticed, and this was a big one for me, was this focus on intervention and support. And one of the sessions, we talked about how visual impairment is something that is regularly verified, but SLD is not. And I found that really fascinating. I thought back to how when we tend to generally repeat assessments every 2 years to ensure that our students have the provisions that they need. And the fact that SLD was not being verified in other countries made me think, wait, but why aren't they verifying it? We verify it. Shouldn't they also be verifying it? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this makes sense. When it comes to disabilities as an adult, you're often needing to make use of government services and support systems in order to prevent fraudulent practices, and in order to ensure that it's being used for the purpose that it's meant for. You need verifications present. But when it comes to children in school, it's not a question of making use of an additional support system. The onus of the education system is to ensure that learning is reaching every single child. So it's not a question of whether you have a diagnosed difficulty, disability, or merely struggles and difficulties. The idea is that the system needs to provide you support, needs to be able to intervene. And the more I thought about this, the more it felt like it made sense. That we need to be focusing more on the support versus the diagnosis. And my next thought, of course, was where I landed with all the other reflections. How do we shift this focus in India? Does this mean that we support best practices at the tier 1 stage? That means that practices improve overall and fewer students require intensive support? Does this mean that regardless of diagnosis, we start providing intervention? I don't know how that would work. As someone who's been a diagnostician for many years, I do see the value in having a diagnosis. But I can't deny, especially in a country like India, where sometimes socioeconomic reasons become the reason why a child isn't able to get that assessment done and therefore the intervention done. There have been times when I thought to myself, you know what? Forget the assessment. I know this family cannot afford it. How about I just go to the teachers instead and give them all the strategies I would give? Because at the end of the day, if the child got diagnosed, I would provide a list of support strategies. If they didn't get diagnosed, I could still provide that list of support strategies and perhaps help that child regardless. So again, like I said before, I don't have answers, but I do think that these are some of the ideas that came through from this session, and something that I definitely think I want to pursue and get a deeper understanding of, apply to various situations, and see what benefits they might yield. Here is my last reflection, and this is a big one. I noticed through a lot of these sessions, we received a lot of data, and data can be a little overwhelming. There's a lot of tables and graphs and numbers, data about prevalence, data about schools available in the country, about age distribution, about population. But as my brain processed this data, I started to realize that I had been thinking from my perspective, from my understanding of the population that I have, which is of course limited, right? I only have knowledge of India. And I realized, for example, when I was listening to the Malaysia session, that there's a huge population difference. India has 1 billion population, Malaysia has 32.7 million. There's going to be a difference of the culture in the society, the way that they function as a result of these prevalence differences. So I realized how important it was for me to notice and acknowledge these differences before I start to mirror or apply any of the strategies, any of these fascinating ideas that I saw in these sessions. The other thing I realized was understanding the journey that a country has taken to arrive at the systems that they are at now. It's not as simple as simply saying, oh, they are doing this, so let me apply this. Seeing how they got to that point gives me an understanding of what I might do, what might make sense for my country, what might make sense for the students that I work with. I recently read this wonderful article on backseat driving in the education circles. This is one of my peers who has she was a former principal, and I love to be able to say she's a peer now, who wrote an article called on backseat driving. You can of course read this article, it's linked to this, but I'm going to summarize what she tries to say. What she's trying to say is that the problems of education are immensely complex. Often we tend to think the solutions are simple. A lot of us do. I know in my 20s, I was this passionate and outspoken, but quite naive person who was trying to solve these complex problems of education with these simple solutions like, Arey, why don't they do this? This assumption that the problems arise not because of systemic issues, not because the problem itself is wicked, it's complex, but because there's laziness and there's corruption in these systems. Having been in this system for the last few years, I realized no, there are issues, but they're not simple to solve. And what I want to do now going forward is avoid being a backseat driver who's trying to, give moral signals about how it should be. Rather, try and go back to the data and the history to understand the perspective, to understand the journey that a country has taken, which will then allow me to actually arrive at reasonable solutions. The reason I put that picture of a fence there is because I want to tell you a little analogy of this fence. So you have two people that are walking on the road and they both see a fence that's blocking their way. One of them says, oh, this fence is blocking my way. Let me get rid of it. And he tries to break down the fence. The other one says, no, wait. I don't know why that fence is there. Maybe it needs to be broken down. Maybe it is blocking the way. But until I understand why that fence was put there, was it put there to keep out animals? Was it put there to keep something in, keep something out, protect something? Until I understand why that system was in place, I cannot just simply jump in, change, and radicalize the system. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that I have had from this entire session, that I, as an individual, would need to spend time delving into the history and the data and the journey that every system has had, not just in other countries for me to mirror them, but even in our own. How did we come about with these systems? We are also at the precipice of a changing system right now, because we've just had our national education policy come out last year. And so, in order for us to simply change the system, we need all of us to be well informed about how that system came to be. So, as educators going forward, I'd recommend to you, don't tear down the fence until you know why that fence is there in the first place. After you know that, your decisions might look very different. Maybe you do have to tear down that fence. Maybe you have to make the fence stronger. I don't know. Let's take our time and understand the history first. So those are some of my thoughts and reflections from this session. But like I said, I am but one person. And what I can do alone is nothing compared to what we can do together. And so we're going to do a little exercise where we say that these 200 plus heads in this session, or 194, are better than my one head. We're going to do something along the same lines as what I've just shared with you. So I want you to take a second to check your understanding. I love Dr. Asmita's three friends. Check your understanding on the basis of things that you don't know, that you don't understand, or that you don't agree with. And ask. Ask and seek understanding first. We say often seek first to understand before we seek to fix. After that, let's look at actions. Let's look at what will this change look like? What's going to be different tomorrow? Now, how are we going to do this? We are going to do this by putting this information together on a Padlet. So once again, I'm going to share the link for this Padlet with you, and I'm putting the link on the chat. If you're already familiar with Padlet, you can go ahead and start putting it in. Otherwise, I'm just going to quickly walk you through what we're going to do. You see, we have two columns on the Padlet. You have questions and you have actionables. Questions. So I want everyone to go on this link, click on the little plus sign below questions, and add at least one question that you have about something you don't know, don't understand, or don't agree with. After that, click on the little plus below the actionables column and share at least one action that you will now take, having attended this conference, having taken in all the information that you got. Why are we doing this? Of course, like I said, I want everyone to be thinking, because the more that we think, the more brains that are doing the thinking, I think the better the outcome for all of us. But the other reason is because it's quite possible that there's a gap in my knowledge that I am not aware of. And when someone else puts a question down about it, I realize, oh, wait, I don't know the answer to that either. And remember, we said we seek first to understand. This way, all of us, all 194 of us, ensure that our understanding and our knowledge base is extremely strong before we start. The other reason is because if you notice, you can comment on other people's questions and actionables. You can also like somebody else's responses. So if you have the answer to a question that someone else has put up, please feel free to put a comment there and answer that question, because we want to use one of the big pieces of any conference is to develop a network, is to be able to communicate across these boundaries. And how do we do that? We need to use these digital mediums to do that. So one of the things that I want you also to do is, if you see a question there that you know the answer to, please go ahead and put the answer in the form of a comment. This is wonderful. Someone saying they don't understand the difference between the terms SLD and specific disorder. Fantastic. At a definitional level of the very thing we began this, there is some confusion. And it's so important to acknowledge that confusion. Today, I am not here to sit and answer these questions. What I want you to do is try and first put these questions down and put the actionables down. And then if we can, we'll also see if we can have our community answer these questions for each other. Please feel free to use this Padlet over the next few weeks. Go back, look at it, look at the questions, look at the answers that have come about to delve into our own understanding. I'd also recommend you don't have to put a comment there. You can click on the plus icon at the bottom of the column, and it will allow you to create your own post, like how this one has created their own post. So with that, I'm going to be quiet for a good 2 minutes and allow everyone to just fill this in before we close for the day. I love this. These are questions that we're all battling with. Diversity creates a lot of challenges. How do we combat that? Absolutely. Do we have to shut down pull-out sessions? And I can see that there's also someone who's already responding and saying, not really. And my instinct was the same. Not really. I do think pull-out has some value. And I think the more that we see, you can also go in there, and I'm going to go in there and say, okay, I agree with that. So if you notice that you agree, something resonates with you, please definitely go in and like that, because that allows us to also gauge what do most people agree with, what's resonating with most people, what solutions are making sense to the largest number of people that can maybe help us gauge if we're in the right direction. That's not to say that majority wins. All solutions that just because a lot of people agree with it doesn't necessarily make it right, but it does help us understand what might make more sense, or what is making sense to most people. If you've finished filling in, you can come back to the Padlet here, and we can look at some of the actionables that people have written down. There might be one actionable that I can think of, but as I'm reading the others, I notice, yes, that's a breakdown, right? We don't have enough screening tools, or I don't have personally knowledge of enough screening tools, perhaps. And that's something I can work on. I also notice, and this is the particularly interesting thing about technology and collaborating in conferences, I notice Shweta Chatterjee is interested in screening tools. Maybe I am interested in screening tools as well. Then I'm going to connect with her. This is going to allow me to connect with her and maybe join hands with somebody else in order to make that actionable possible. You might notice you may have educators from your institution, from your college, or from your school who may have similar goals to you. It makes sense to then collaborate and try and work on these goals together. Standardized tests in regional languages, absolutely. And these actionables are a great way. Research, in fact, shows that what tends to often happen at the end of workshops and conferences is that people tend to have a lot of notes and a lot of learning, and often have the PPT and everything to refer to, but it doesn't turn into anything. The best practice that often leads to action is taking a minute to think of the action. So if you haven't, I'd highly recommend go on the Padlet, take a minute, and simply write down the actionable. It's one of the best ways of ensuring that it turns into something concrete. All right. We're almost out of time, so I want to quickly just go to the very last thing that I wanted to talk about, and that is experimentation and risk. Now, because the problems in education, in the case of special education, in the case of disabilities, are so complex, there often tends not to be an outright correct or incorrect answer. Every country is at a different stage of experimentation. Here's an example. You look at universal screening. I know some countries are at a system where we don't have universal screening. Certainly not that's been governed across schools, across regions, across states. We may have a reference system that can often have multiple failures. A lot of us talked about how we aren't getting referrals during the pandemic. Does that mean there aren't students who have needs during the pandemic? Absolutely not. Which means the system doesn't seem to be capturing that. So there are flaws there. You look at countries where universal screening has become a norm, standardized testing exists across years, across the entire country, across schooling, across various age groups. Excellent, it helps with identification. But it can also sometimes become too much pressure. We can start teaching to the test. So we're teaching just so that our kids can clear that standardized test. We often end up relying on the data of the standardized test far too heavily to look at, policy changes and things like that. So there's pros and cons for every system. So then how do we know what works? How do we know what we should be doing? I did have a moment when I felt like, but then I'm not arriving at answers. And shouldn't I be arriving at answers? The reality is that all experimentation carries risks. All policies, all decisions, all processes carry their pros and cons. The only way that we can mitigate those those cons as far as possible is for us to be communicating with each other. That communication, open communication with each other across countries, understanding each other's perspectives before we seek to action something is the key. And that's exactly what this conference is all about. It's about enhancing and enabling communication across boundaries in order for us to mitigate those risks, amp up the experimentation, and hopefully arrive at solutions that benefit the students across all our countries and therefore across the world. Thank you so much for spending the last 30 to 40 minutes with me. And I'm going to hand it back over to the HSCSE team to bring this to a close.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for summing up the.
Before you start,
Yes.
a big tight hug to you, Radhika, because we discussed so much about it. I think it was right from 12 midnight to 1:30 a.m. that we were talking about this session. And I really, really feel blessed. Where were you so many years? How come we didn't bump into each other's earlier? Thank you so much. Over to you, Vinita.
Thank you, ma'am. So, Radhika, ma'am, thank you so much for summing up 3 days of conference just in one session. That too so innovatively and so aptly. You have left us with some food for thought. Now, I invite Anaga Afridi, ma'am, co-founder of Astitva Clinic, to offer vote of thanks. Over to you, ma'am.
You're on mute.
Anaga, you have to unmute.
Sorry. I'm too excited to give vote of thanks. First of all, a big thank you to Dr. Asmita Udar ma'am for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Nisha, and the entire team of HUCSE. I must say, ma'am, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I think all 190 of us over here would agree to that. It was superb journey across countries, and we learned a lot. We had a lot to take away. Yeah. Now I'm not going to. I'm going to quickly say the word of thanks because I'm waiting for that. I think, ma'am, you were Radhika Chandrasekharan, ma'am. You were just wonderful. I think everyone will agree that it was definitely a different and a unique way to sum up the conference. A conference that has been for 3 days, running across through all countries, was summed up beautifully in just 30 minutes. And I must say, the tiredness word that came, you literally reversed us back and we are jumping again. I think Dr. Asmita Uddar ma'am can have 2 more sessions and we would be still alert. You have literally put us back into action. It was really wonderful. And all your run through from your audience check to perspectives to reflect, retire reflective. I love the backseat driving. I love the Padlet. Padlet was new for me, of course, but yes, I'm going to try it now. I will surely try it in my clinic also. And last, also your experimentation and risk. Thank you so much, ma'am. On behalf of Akshay and the entire team here, I would like to give you a vote of thanks. Thank you so much.
Now we will stop our recording here.